The house felt different after 7 o'clock. During the day, sunlight streaming through my carefully chosen curtains made everything seem purposeful. The sage green throw pillows I'd arranged just so, the reclaimed wood coffee table positioned at exactly the right angle. But once evening settled in, all my interior designer's touches couldn't disguise the truth. This house was a stage set for one. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the single place setting I'd laid out on the granite island. 2 years. 2 years since David walked out with his suitcase and his explanations about growing in different directions. 2 years of telling myself I was better off, stronger now, finally free to make choices without consulting anyone else. The pasta water bubbled aggressively, steam fogging the window that looked out onto my neighbor's perfectly manicured lawn. Mrs. Chin next door was probably settling down to dinner with her husband of 43 years right about now. The thought made my chest tighten in a way I'd learned to push aside. "This is ridiculous, Sophia," I said aloud, my voice echoing off the subway tiles I'd installed myself. "You're 49 years old, not 90. But saying it didn't make the silence any less oppressive. I drained the pasta with more force than necessary, the steam rising like a small rebellion. Through the kitchen window, I could see the Hendersons' dinner party in full swing, warm light spilling from their dining room, shadows of people gesturing with wine glasses, heads thrown back in laughter. I'd been invited, of course. Linda Henderson had been asking me to join their gatherings for months now, always with that particular tone divorced women recognize, equal parts pity and determination to get me back out there. I declined again this week. The thought of sitting at someone else's table, being the odd number that required careful seating arrangements, made my stomach churn worse than the loneliness itself. The pasta tasted like cardboard, though I'd made it dozens of times before. Everything had been tasting like cardboard lately. I ate mechanically, scrolling through emails on my phone, 3 potential clients, 2 vendor confirmations, and 17 promotional messages I'd delete without reading. This was my life now. Efficient, organized, predictable. Safe. After dinner, I wandered through my living room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. The house was exactly as I'd envisioned when I'd bought it during the divorce, a sanctuary of neutral colors and clean lines, a place where I could heal and start over. But healing, I discovered, was different from living. The silence pressed against me like a weight. I turned on the television, but the canned laughter from some sitcom only made the emptiness more pronounced. I tried reading, but the words blurred together. Even my sketchbook, usually my refugee, felt foreign under my fingers tonight. By 9:30, I found myself standing in front of my laptop, my finger hovering over the power button. This was dangerous territory, the place where lonely women made impulsive decisions they'd regret in the morning. But something about the evening felt different, charged with a restlessness I couldn't shake. The travel website opened like a portal to possibility. Sunny beaches, mountain retreats, European river cruises. My eyes stopped on an image of a cruise ship at sunset, its lights reflecting on dark water like scattered stars. 7-night Caribbean cruise, departing Fort Lauderdale. I'd never taken a cruise. David had always dismissed them as floating shopping malls for people with no imagination. But David wasn't here anymore, and his opinions had lost their power to shape my choices. My finger moved across the trackpad almost of its own accord. Interior stateroom with balcony. Single occupancy. I paused at the price. It wasn't cheap, but what was I saving money for anymore? Some future that felt as distant as the horizon. The booking confirmation appeared on screen before I'd fully processed what I was doing. Departure date, 3 weeks from tomorrow. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering with equal parts excitement and terror. What had I just done? 3 weeks later, I stood on the dock in Fort Lauderdale, clutching my purse strap like a lifeline. The ship rose before me like a floating city, impossibly large, impossibly white against the Florida sky. Families with children streamed past me, couples holding hands, groups of friends already laughing about adventures yet to come. I felt conspicuously alone, like someone had forgotten to tell me the rules of this particular game. First cruise? I turned to find an older woman beside me, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob, her eyes bright with curiosity behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a flowing coral-colored dress that suggested someone comfortable with attention. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, managing a smile. "Only to another solo traveler," she said with a wink. "I'm Maggie Hale. Been cruising alone for 15 years, ever since my Herald passed. Best decision I ever made." "Sophia Bennett," I said, extending my hand. "I'm not sure what I've gotten myself into." Maggie's laugh was warm and knowing. "Oh, my dear, that's exactly the right frame of mind. Funny thing about the sea, it has a way of putting strangers in the same tide." Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. There was a quality about Maggie that reminded me of the retired librarians I'd known growing up, people who'd spent their lives reading between the lines, who could sense stories before they'd fully unfolded. The boarding process was a blur of luggage tags and safety briefings, of narrow hallways that seemed to stretch in every direction. My stateroom was compact but elegant, with a small balcony that looked out onto nothing but ocean. I unpacked slowly, hanging my carefully chosen cruise wardrobe in the tiny closet, clothes I'd bought specifically for this trip, as if changing my wardrobe might change who I was. But as I stood on the balcony that first afternoon, watching the Florida coastline shrink to a thin line on the horizon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The ship's horn sounded long and low, and we were moving, really moving, carrying me towards something unknown. The first night's dinner seating was a revelation in controlled chaos. The main dining room sparkled with crystal and silver, conversations bubbling up from every table like champagne. I'd been assigned to a table for 8, 3 couples and Maggie and myself, the 2 singleton bookends. "So what brings you on this cruise, Sophia?" asked Janet, one half of a couple from Ohio who'd been cruising together for 20 years. The question I'd been dreading. I'd rehearsed several answers, needed a break from work, always wanted to try a cruise, celebrating my freedom. But under the warm dining room lights, surrounded by the gentle clatter of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation, something more honest slipped out. "I booked it on impulse," I said. I was sitting in my kitchen, and everything felt so quiet. I needed to go somewhere I'd never been, do something I'd never done. Maggie nodded approvingly. "The best adventures start with restlessness," she said. "When you're comfortable, you're not growing." As if to prove her point, our waiter appeared, a young man from the Philippines with an infectious smile who insisted on explaining every dish in detail. His enthusiasm for the lobster bisque so genuine that even the most reserved couple at our table was soon laughing. But it was during dessert that it happened. I was listening to Janet tell a story about their first cruise disaster, something involving a missed port and a stomach bug, when I felt eyes on me. Not the casual glances that happen in crowded rooms, but something more focused, more intentional. I looked up and found myself staring across the dining room at a man I'd never seen before. He was sitting 3 tables away, nursing what looked like red wine, his attention clearly on me rather than his dinner companions. He was perhaps 10 years older than me, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of understated elegance that comes from confidence rather than trying too hard. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he raised his wine glass slightly in my direction, not quite a toast, more like an acknowledgement. Heat rose in my cheeks, and I quickly looked back to my table, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. When I dared to glance back a few minutes later, he was gone. "Everything all right, dear?" Maggie asked, following my gaze across the now empty table. "Fine," I said quickly. "Just, looking around." But Maggie's knowing smile suggested she'd seen exactly what I'd been looking at. After dinner, I found myself wandering the ship's walkway, needing air and space to process the evening. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, dark water meeting darker sky at a horizon I could no longer see. Other passengers strolled past, couples holding hands, families with teenagers who looked bored despite the magic surrounding them, solo travelers like myself clutching coffee cups and cameras. I stopped at the railing, letting the salt air fill my lungs. For the first time in 2 years, I felt truly present in my own life. Not planning the next day or analyzing the previous one, just existing in this moment between water and stars. "Beautiful night." The voice came from beside me, and I didn't need to turn to know it belonged to the man from dinner. My pulse quickened in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I turned slowly, and there he was, closer than he'd seemed across the dining room, close enough that I could see the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his dark sweater brought out the gray in his hair. "It is," I managed, surprised my voice sounded steady. "I'm Adrian," he said, extending his hand. "Adrian Clarke." "Sophia Bennett." His hand was warm, his grip firm without being presumptuous. "I saw you at dinner. I was hoping you had." His smile was gentle, not the aggressive charm I learned to recognize and deflect in the few dates I'd attempted since my divorce. "First cruise? That obvious? Only because you look like I felt on my first one, equal parts wonder and panic." I laughed, surprising myself. "That's exactly right. Like I've walked into someone else's life by mistake." "The feeling fades," Adrian said. "Or maybe you just decide the mistake was waiting so long to try it." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the ship's movement creating a gentle rhythm beneath our feet. Other passengers passed by, their conversations mixing with the sound of water against the hull, but it felt like we were alone in our small pocket of deck. "What do you do when you're not floating around the Caribbean?" Adrian asked. "Interior design," I said. "I help people make their houses feel like homes." "And does your house feel like home?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. Most people asked about my work, my clients, the decorating shows they'd seen on television. No one had ever asked me that. "It's beautiful," I said carefully. "That's not what I asked." I studied his face in the dim light from the deck lamps. There was something about Adrian that invited honesty, a quality of attention that made me want to tell the truth even when it wasn't comfortable. "No," I said quietly. "It feels like a stage set. Perfect and empty." Adrian nodded as if this made complete sense. "I have one of those too. Every morning I walk through rooms my wife decorated, and I can't decide if changing anything would be betrayal or necessity. The mention of his wife created a pause between us, heavy with an unspoken story. I waited, sensing there was more. She died 3 years ago, Adrian said simply. It was cancer. I kept thinking I'd know when it was time to start over, but time just keeps passing. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. My divorce suddenly appeared to be a small grief in the shadow of his loss. Thank you. What about you? Divorced, separated, or just tired of dating? Divorced. 2 years. I paused, then added, he said we were growing in different directions. Turns out his direction included his assistant, still in her 20s. Ah, Adrian said. The classic midlife crisis trajectory. How original of him. His dry tone made me smile despite myself. That's exactly what my sister said. Smart sister. What else did she tell you? To stop hiding in my house and start living again. I looked out at the dark water. I think this cruise was supposed to be step 1. How's it working so far? I turned to look at him fully, this stranger who'd somehow gotten me to reveal more about myself in 10 minutes than I'd shared with anyone in months. The deck lights cast his features in soft shadows, making him seem both mysterious and familiar. Ask me in a week, I said. Adrian's smile reached his eyes. I intend to. A comfortable warmth settled between us, the kind that comes from unexpected connection. We talked for another hour, about books, about travel, about the strange intimacy of being strangers on a ship. He told me he imported wine, that he'd learned more about loneliness in a house full of memories than he'd ever wanted to know. I found myself describing the divorce, the slow process of rebuilding a life that felt authentically mine rather than some compromised version of what marriage had required. It's strange, I said as the evening wound down. I thought I wanted to be alone. After so many years of checking in with someone else, making decisions by committee, I thought solitude would feel like freedom. But it doesn't. It feels like waiting. Like I'm in some kind of holding pattern, but I don't know what I'm waiting for. Adrian was quiet for a moment, his gaze focused on the horizon. Maybe you're not waiting for something. Maybe you're waiting to become someone. The words hit me with unexpected force. Not waiting for the right person or the right opportunity, but waiting to become the version of myself that could handle whatever came next. That's terrifying, I said. The best changes usually are. When we finally said goodnight, Adrian's hand brushed mine briefly as we parted ways. It was barely contact, but I felt it all the way back to my stateroom. I stood on my balcony for a long time afterward, listening to the sound of water against the ship's hull, feeling something inside me shift and settle like furniture finding its proper place. For the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, like the pause before music begins. I woke the next morning with sunlight streaming through my balcony doors and something I hadn't felt in years, anticipation. Not the anxious kind that comes with deadlines or difficult conversations, but the sweet flutter of possibility. For a moment, I lay in bed listening to the gentle hum of the ship's engines, remembering the warmth in Adrian's voice when he'd said he intended to ask me again about how the cruise was working out. The mirror in my tiny bathroom reflected a woman I barely recognized. My cheeks had color from yesterday's sea air, and my eyes held a brightness that had nothing to do with the morning light. I'd slept better than I had in months. After a leisurely breakfast on my balcony, fresh fruit and coffee that tasted like possibility, I decided to explore the ship properly. Yesterday had been about survival, about getting my bearings and not looking completely lost. Today felt different. Today I wanted to see what this floating city had to offer. The ship was enormous, a maze of decks and lounges, shops and theaters, all connected by corridors that seemed to stretch forever. I found myself in the library first, drawn by the familiar comfort of books and quiet corners. It was smaller than I'd expected but beautifully appointed, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the endless blue. Finding your way around? I turned to find Maggie settling into a leather chair nearby, a mystery novel in her hands and that same knowing smile from yesterday evening. Slowly, I said, selecting a book from the shelf, something light and romantic that I'd never admit to reading at home. This place is like a small town, isn't it? With better room service and more interesting neighbors, Maggie said with a chuckle. Speaking of which, how was your evening stroll? Heat crept up my neck. Peaceful. Aha! Maggie's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. And how was your conversation with that distinguished gentleman from dinner? I should have known she'd noticed. You don't miss much, do you? Honey, when you've been watching human nature as long as I have, you learn to spot the interesting developments. Adrian Clarke, right? Wine importer from San Francisco. Widowed 3 years ago, travels alone now but hasn't quite figured out how to be alone. I stared at her. How do you possibly know all that? Ship gossip travels faster than the Wi-Fi, Maggie said with a grin. Plus, I may have struck up a conversation with his dinner companions this morning. Research purposes, you understand. Research for what? For determining whether he's worth your time, dear. A woman our age can't be too careful about where she invests her emotional energy. The casual way she'd said our age made me smile. At 71, Maggie had lived through more than I'd even begun to understand, but she had a way of making me feel like we were conspirators rather than generations apart. And your research conclusions? Still gathering data, Maggie said mysteriously. But the preliminary results are promising. I spent the morning reading and watching the ocean, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The ship's rhythm was soothing, the gentle roll beneath my feet, the distant sound of laughter from the pool deck, the soft chime that announced activities throughout the day. It was like being held in some kind of floating sanctuary, removed from all the sharp edges of real life. Around noon, the ship's speaker system crackled to life with the day's announcements. Poolside trivia, a cooking demonstration, afternoon tea in the Queen's Lounge. But one announcement made my pulse quicken: wine tasting in the vintage cellar, 2 o'clock, featuring selections from California's finest vineyards. I told myself I was going because I appreciated good wine. I told myself it had nothing to do with Adrian's mention that he imported wine. I told myself a lot of things as I stood in front of my closet at 1:30, trying to decide what someone wore to a wine tasting on a cruise ship. I settled on a navy dress that skimmed my knees, not too casual, not trying too hard. The vintage cellar turned out to be an intimate space on one of the lower decks, designed to look like an authentic wine cave with stone walls and dim lighting. About 20 passengers had gathered, most of them couples, though I spotted a few solo travelers like myself. The sommelier was explaining the first wine, a Sauvignon Blanc from Sonoma, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Excellent choice. That vineyard produces some of the most consistent whites on the West Coast. I turned, my heart doing that complicated dance again, and found Adrian standing just close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and woodsy that suited him perfectly. You know this wine? I asked, accepting a glass from the passing server. I should. I import it. Adrian's smile was warm, but there was something different about him today, more confident, more at ease. May I? He gestured to the space beside me at the high-top table I'd been leaning against. I nodded, probably too quickly, and felt that familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. So this is what you do, I said, watching him swirl the wine in his glass with practiced ease. Travel the world, tasting wine. Part of it, Adrian said. Though most of my time is spent in warehouses and offices, dealing with customs paperwork and profit margins. Not nearly as glamorous as it sounds. He sipped the wine, considering. But this, he gestured around the intimate space, this is the part I love. Sharing something beautiful with people who might not have discovered it otherwise. The sommelier moved on to the second wine, a Pinot Noir, and Adrian's commentary became more animated. He talked about the vineyard's history, the particular challenges of that growing season, the way certain soils affected the grape's character. I found myself less interested in the wine than in watching him talk about it, the way his eyes lit up, the graceful movements of his hands as he described the wine's journey from vine to bottle. You really love this, I observed. I do? It took me a while to figure that out, actually. Adrian paused, his expression growing more thoughtful. I fell into wine importing almost by accident. I was in international business, dealing mostly with electronics, when a client in Napa asked me to help him export some wines. One thing led to another, and suddenly I had a new career. When was this? About 5 years ago. Right around the time Claire, my wife, was diagnosed. His voice didn't change when he mentioned her, but I noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. She encouraged me to make the switch. Said life was too short to spend it selling things that didn't matter to you. The third wine was a bold Cabernet, and Adrian's knowledge impressed even the sommelier, who began directing questions to him about aging and tannin structure. I watched other passengers gravitate toward our table, drawn by Adrian's expertise and natural warmth. He had a gift for making complex topics accessible, for sharing his knowledge without making others feel ignorant. And what about you? Adrian asked during a lull in the conversation. How did you end up in interior design? I was an art major in college, but I was practical enough to know I couldn't make a living painting. Interior design felt like a compromise, still creative, but with actual job prospects. Do you love it? The question caught me off guard. It was the same thing he'd asked about my house the night before, direct and somehow more intimate than the surface conversation we'd been having. I used to, I said slowly. In the beginning, I loved the problem-solving aspect of it. Taking a space that wasn't working and figuring out how to make it beautiful and functional. But lately? I swirled my wine, watching the dark liquid catch the light. Lately it feels like I'm helping other people create homes while mine feels like a museum. Adrian nodded as if this made perfect sense. After Claire died, I kept her things exactly as she'd left them for almost 2 years. Her coffee cup still sat on her nightstand. Her reading glasses were still folded on top of her book. I told myself I was preserving her memory, but really I was afraid that changing anything would mean accepting she was gone. What changed your mind? My daughter. She came for Christmas last year and found me living like a caretaker in my own house. She said, "Dad, Mom didn't want you to turn your home into a shrine. She wanted you to keep living." The wine tasting continued around us, but our conversation had shifted into something more private, more real. Other passengers laughed and clinked glasses, but Adrian and I had found our own small island of intimacy in the crowded room. "Have you started living again?" Adrian considered this, his gaze focused on something beyond the stone walls of the wine cellar. "I'm learning. This cruise is actually part of that process. My daughter insisted I book it. Said I needed to go somewhere I'd never been with Claire, do something that was just mine." "And how's it working so far?" Adrian's smile was soft, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Ask me in a week." The echo of my own words from the night before created a moment of perfect understanding between us. We were both here for the same reason, both trying to figure out how to move forward after loss had left us stranded. The wine tasting ended with a dessert wine that was sweet and complex, like liquid gold in the dim light. Adrian walked me out of the cellar, our conversation continuing as we found ourselves on one of the quieter decks, away from the afternoon crowds. "I have to confess something," Adrian said as we settled onto a pair of deck chairs that faced the ocean. "I didn't just happen upon that wine tasting. I saw it on the daily program and thought you might enjoy it. You came looking for me?" "I came hoping to see you again." His honesty was both thrilling and terrifying. "Is that too forward?" I thought about the careful way I'd been living for the past 2 years, measured steps, safe choices, nothing that risked too much or revealed too much. Then I thought about last night's conversation, about the way talking to Adrian had felt like coming up for air after being underwater. "No," I said. "It's perfect." We spent the afternoon talking and watching the ocean change color as the sun moved across the sky. Adrian told me about his daughter, a pediatric nurse in Seattle who called him twice a week to make sure he was eating properly and not becoming a hermit. I told him about my sister, who'd been trying to set me up with every available man in our hometown since the divorce was final. "They mean well," Adrian said. "They do. But there's something exhausting about other people's determination to fix your life for you. Especially when you're not sure you're ready to be fixed." "Exactly." I turned to look at him fully. "But this doesn't feel like being fixed. This feels like..." "Like what?" "Like remembering who I used to be. Before I became half of a couple, before I learned to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's life." Adrian was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Claire used to say that marriage should make you more yourself, not less. It took me a long time after she died to understand what she meant." "What did she mean?" "That the right person doesn't complete you. They give you the safety to become completely yourself." The words settled between us like a promise or a prayer. I felt something shifting inside my chest, a loosening of knots I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten they were there. Dinner that night was a revelation. Adrian had somehow arranged to be moved to our table, and his presence transformed the entire dynamic. He drew out the quiet Ohio couple with questions about their travels, made Maggie laugh with stories from his wine importing adventures, and somehow made me feel like the most interesting person in the room without saying anything that could be construed as flirtation. "He's good," Maggie murmured to me as we walked to the evening show together. "Smooth without being slick, attentive without being obvious. You approve." "I'm still gathering data," she said with a grin. But the preliminary results continued to be promising. The evening show was a production of classic Broadway songs, performed in a theater that rivaled anything on land. I found myself sitting next to Adrian, acutely aware of his presence, the way he laughed at the comedian's jokes, the way he applauded enthusiastically for the singers, the way his knee occasionally brushed against mine in the narrow theater seats. After the show, we found ourselves walking the promenade deck again, as if drawn by the same magnetic pull that had brought us together the night before. The moon was fuller tonight, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "Thank you for today," I said as we stopped at the same spot where we talked the night before. "Thank you for letting me intrude on your wine education." "Is that what you were doing? Intruding?" Adrian turned to face me fully, and I could see the moonlight reflected in his eyes. "I was hoping to spend time with you. Everything else was just an excuse." The honesty in his voice made my heart race. This was dangerous territory, the place where careful women made choices they couldn't take back. But standing there in the moonlight, with the sound of water against the hull and Adrian's eyes holding mine, I couldn't remember why being careful had ever seemed important. "I'm glad you did," I said softly. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the question in his eyes before he asked it. "Sophia," he said, my name barely more than a whisper. I knew what he was asking. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the careful way he held himself just far enough away to give me the choice. For a moment, I thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. We barely knew each other, we were both dealing with complicated histories, this was a cruise and nothing that happened on a cruise was real. But then Adrian lifted his hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and all those reasonable thoughts dissolved like sugar in water. "Yes," I whispered, not even sure what I was agreeing to, only knowing that whatever Adrian was offering, I wanted it. When he kissed me, it was nothing like the tentative, apologetic kisses of my marriage's final years. Adrian kissed me like he meant it, like I was something precious and desirable and worth pursuing. His lips were warm and sure, his hands gentle but confident as they framed my face. I felt something inside me that had been sleeping for 2 years, suddenly wake up and stretch toward the light. When we broke apart, we were both breathing harder, and Adrian rested his forehead against mine. "I should probably say good night," he said, but he made no move to leave. "You probably should," I agreed, but I didn't step away either. We stood there for another few minutes, talking in soft voices about nothing important, reluctant to break the spell that had settled over us. Finally, Adrian walked me to my stateroom, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, a touch that felt both protective and possessive. "Sweet dreams, Sophia," he said, lifting my hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to my palm. I watched him walk away before letting myself into my room, my heart still racing from the evening's events. On my balcony, I stood looking out at the moon's path on the water, replaying every moment of the day, the wine tasting, our conversations, that perfect, unexpected kiss. For the first time since my divorce, I felt beautiful. Not just attractive or acceptable, but genuinely, powerfully beautiful. Adrian looked at me like I was something wonderful, like I was worth crossing a crowded room to reach. I fell asleep that night with the taste of wine and possibility on my lips, the sound of the ocean mixing with dreams of tomorrow. Whatever was happening between Adrian and me, it felt like the beginning of something I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. But as I drifted off to sleep, Maggie's voice echoed in my mind, still gathering data. Something in her tone suggested there was more to learn, more to discover. I had no idea how right she would turn out to be. I woke to the gentle sway of the ship and the memory of Adrian's lips on mine. The morning light streaming through my balcony doors seemed brighter somehow, charged with the same electricity that had coursed through me when he'd kissed me goodnight. I touched my fingers to my lips, still feeling the warmth of his mouth, the careful way he'd held my face like I was something fragile and precious. This was uncharted territory for me. Even in college, even during the early days of my marriage, I'd never felt this kind of anticipation, this delicious nervousness that made my skin feel too small and my heart beat too fast. At 49, I was discovering sensations I thought belonged only to teenagers in romance novels. The woman in the mirror looked different again today. There was a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with sea air, a softness around her eyes that spoke of dreams filled with possibility. I chose my clothes more carefully than usual, a flowing white dress that caught the ocean breeze beautifully, a touch of lipstick that made me feel feminine and confident. Breakfast was a leisurely affair on my balcony, but I found myself watching the horizon, wondering where Adrian was, what he was doing, whether he was thinking about me the way I was thinking about him. The kiss had changed everything between us, had shifted us from friendly strangers to something more complicated and infinitely more thrilling. I spent the morning by the pool, reading but not really absorbing the words on the page. Every time someone walked by, I looked up hopefully, though I tried to be subtle about it. Around 11, I spotted Maggie approaching with 2 tropical drinks, her silver hair gleaming in the sunshine. "You look like a woman who could use some company," she said, settling into the chair beside mine. "And possibly some rum." "It's 11 in the morning," I laughed, but I accepted the drink gratefully. "Dear, we're on vacation. Different rules apply." Maggie adjusted her sun hat and studied me over the rim of her sunglasses. "You're glowing today. That was quite a kiss last night." I nearly choked on my drink. "Were you watching?" "Honey, half the ship was watching. You two were standing right under the deck lights, lost in your own little world. It was quite romantic, actually." Heat flooded my cheeks. "Oh God, I never even thought." "Don't you dare be embarrassed," Maggie said firmly. "It's been a long time since I've seen 2 people discover each other like that. It was beautiful." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching families play in the pool, couples reading together under umbrellas, teenagers trying to look bored while their parents took vacation photos. It struck me how many different kinds of happiness were represented around this pool deck: young love, established love, family joy, the simple pleasure of doing nothing in beautiful surroundings. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. "Of course. How do you know when you're ready? After the loss, I mean. How do you know when it's safe to let someone in again?" Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze focused on something beyond the pool deck. "I don't think you ever really know," she said finally. "I think you just reach a point where being afraid of getting hurt seems less important than the possibility of being happy. But what if? What if he breaks your heart? What if this is just a cruise romance that doesn't survive dry land? What if you're setting yourself up for disappointment?" Maggie turned to look at me directly. "Sweetheart, what if you're not?" The afternoon brought news that we'd be docking at our first port tomorrow, a small island famous for its snorkeling and duty-free shopping. The ship buzzed with excitement as passengers made plans, compared shore excursions, and debated whether to stay on board or explore. I was considering my options when I heard Adrian's voice behind me. "Have you decided what you're doing tomorrow?" I turned, my heart doing that familiar leap at the sight of him. He looked relaxed and handsome in khaki shorts and a polo shirt that brought out the green in his eyes. But there was something different about his expression today, a warmth and confidence that suggested last night had affected him as much as it had me. "I was thinking about snorkeling," I said. "I haven't done it in years, but this seems like the perfect opportunity." "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already booked a spot on one of the smaller boat tours. Less crowded, better reefs. Would you like to join me?" The invitation felt like more than just a shared activity. It felt like Adrian was asking me to spend the day with him, to let this connection between us continue developing in the bright light of day rather than just the romantic atmosphere of evening deck walks. "I'd love to," I said, and his smile in response made my stomach flutter. "Perfect. We leave the ship at 9. Adrian paused, his gaze holding mine. "I'm looking forward to it, Sophia. To spend the day with you." The rest of the afternoon passed in a pleasant haze of anticipation and conversation. Adrian and I found ourselves in the ship's quiet library, talking about books and travel, about our different perspectives on life after loss. He was reading a biography of a famous explorer, while I'd picked up a mystery novel that I couldn't seem to concentrate on. "You're not really reading that, are you?" Adrian observed with amusement. "Is it that obvious? You've been on the same page for 20 minutes. I laughed and closed the book. "I keep getting distracted." "By what?" "By you," I thought but didn't say. "By the way, you look at me like I'm interesting and beautiful. By the memory of your kiss and the anticipation of what might happen next." "By everything," I said instead. "This whole experience is so different from anything I'm used to. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Is that good or bad?" "I think it's good. Scary, but good." Adrian reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. The simple touch sent warmth shooting up my arm and settling somewhere deep in my chest. "I know what you mean," he said softly. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm not supposed to feel this happy." The honesty in his voice made my breath catch. We were treading into territory that felt both thrilling and dangerous, the place where casual attraction becomes something deeper, more meaningful. That evening, I dressed for dinner with extra care, choosing a deep blue dress that made my eyes look brighter and my skin seem to glow. When I arrived at our table, Adrian was already there, and the way his eyes lit up when he saw me made all the extra effort worthwhile. Dinner conversation flowed easily among our table mates, but I was acutely aware of Adrian beside me, the way he listened when I spoke, the way he found small opportunities to touch my hand or my shoulder, the way his laugh made something warm and liquid settle in my stomach. After dinner, Adrian suggested we skip the evening show and take another walk on the deck walkway. The night was perfect, warm but not humid, with a gentle breeze that carried the salt scent of the ocean. We found a quiet spot away from the crowds, where we could talk without being overheard. "Tomorrow will be our first real day together," Adrian said, leaning against the railing beside me. "Away from the ship, just the two of us exploring somewhere new. Are you nervous?" I asked. "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. "It's been a long time since I felt this way about someone. I keep wondering if I remember how to do this." His vulnerability touched something deep inside me. Here was this confident, accomplished man admitting to the same fears and uncertainties I'd been carrying. "I don't think I ever knew how to do this," I confessed. "My marriage was so practical, so safe. We dated for 2 years before David even kissed me properly. This feels like jumping off a cliff in comparison. Are you having second thoughts? I turned to face him fully, taking in the way the moonlight played across his features, the genuine concern in his eyes, the careful way he held himself, close enough to touch but giving me space to choose. No, I said firmly. I'm tired of being safe. I'm tired of living a half-life because it's easier than risking disappointment. Adrian's smile was soft and relieved. Good. Because I have a confession to make. What's that? I've been thinking about kissing you again all day. My heart stopped, then started again double time. Just thinking about it? Adrian's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame my face just like the night before. Would you like me to do more than think about it? Instead of answering with words, I rose up on my toes and kissed him first, pouring all my nervous energy and growing feelings into the connection between us. Adrian responded immediately, his arms coming around me and pulling me closer, his kiss deeper and more passionate than the night before. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. Sophia, Adrian whispered against my forehead, you're going to be the death of me. I laughed softly, feeling bold and alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I certainly hope not. We have snorkeling plans tomorrow. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and dreams, the conversation punctuated by soft kisses and gentle touches. By the time Adrian walked me back to my stateroom, I felt like we'd crossed some invisible line from attraction into something deeper and more significant. Sweet dreams, Adrian murmured, pressing one last kiss to my lips before reluctantly stepping away. But as I got ready for bed, my mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow, to our first day together away from the ship, to all the possibilities that lay ahead of us. I fell asleep easily that night, my dreams filled with clear blue water and Adrian's smile, with the promise of adventure and the sweet anticipation of what tomorrow might bring. The last thing I remembered before sleep claimed me was the feeling of Adrian's hands in my hair and the certainty that something wonderful was beginning. But sometimes the most beautiful dreams are the ones that prepare us for the most difficult awakenings. The next morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for our snorkeling expedition. I dressed in my swimsuit and cover-up, applied waterproof sunscreen, and practically bounced with excitement as I made my way to the meeting point near the gangway. Other passengers were already gathering, couples with matching sun hats, families with children clutching snorkel gear, a few solo travelers like myself. I looked around for Adrian but didn't see him yet, though we still had 15 minutes before departure time. That's when I saw her. Lena Torres was impossible to miss, a stunning young woman with glossy black hair and the kind of effortless beauty that made other women feel suddenly ordinary. She was the ship's event coordinator, always in the middle of whatever activity was happening, always surrounded by laughter and energy. I'd noticed her before but only in passing, the way you notice someone who seems to exist in a different orbit from your own. What made my stomach drop was that Adrian was walking toward the group with her, their heads bent close together in conversation, her hand resting casually on his arm as she laughed at something he'd said. They looked comfortable together. Familiar. Like two people who'd spent time getting to know each other. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I watched them. Adrian was smiling at Lena with the same warmth I thought was reserved for me, listening to her with the same focused attention that had made me feel so special the night before. Sophia. There you are. Adrian's voice cut through my spiral of doubt, and I looked up to find him approaching with Lena beside him. His smile was bright and genuine, without a trace of guilt or awareness that anything might be wrong. "Lena was just telling me about the best spots on the reef," Adrian said cheerfully. "She's done this excursion dozens of times." "Lena, this is Sophia Bennett, the one I was telling you about." The one he was telling her about? My mind immediately began racing through all the possible interpretations of that phrase, none of them comforting. "So nice to meet you properly," Lena said with genuine enthusiasm, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and friendly, her smile completely without artifice. "Adrian's been talking about you non-stop since yesterday. He's absolutely smitten." I should have felt relieved by her words, should have recognized the innocent friendliness in her tone. But something about the easy familiarity between them, the way she said his name like she'd been saying it for years rather than days, made my newly awakened confidence crumble. "How long have you two known each other?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and casual. "Oh, we met at the wine tasting 2 days ago," Lena said brightly. "I helped organize it, and Adrian was so knowledgeable about the selections. We ended up talking for hours afterward about different vineyards and import regulations. It was fascinating." Hours afterward. While I'd been on my balcony, replaying our conversation and treasuring the memory of our first real talk, Adrian had been with Lena, talking for hours about wine and business. The tour guide called for everyone to board the boat, and I found myself moving mechanically through the motions of finding a seat, accepting a life jacket, listening to the safety briefing. But my mind was stuck on the image of Adrian and Lena talking for hours, of her hand on his arm, of the easy way they'd walked up together this morning. I'd been married for 15 years. I knew the signs of a man who was interested in someone else, who was keeping his options open while maintaining plausible deniability. I'd lived through David's months of working late and client meetings before I discovered the truth about his assistant. The rational part of my brain tried to argue that this was different, that Adrian wasn't David, that I was letting old wounds color new situations. But the scared part of me, the part that had spent 2 years learning to be alone rather than risk being fooled again, was louder. During the boat ride to the reef, I watched Adrian and Lena continue their easy conversation, their shared laughter, the way she leaned in close when the engine noise made it hard to hear. They looked like two people who enjoyed each other's company, who had things in common, who might have a future together. And what did Adrian and I have? 3 days of conversations and 2 kisses. A connection that might be nothing more than cruise ship fantasy, the kind of temporary romance that dissolved the moment real life intruded. By the time we reached the snorkeling site, my earlier excitement had curdled into something darker and more familiar. I felt foolish for believing that someone like Adrian, sophisticated, worldly, genuinely charming, would be seriously interested in someone like me. A divorced interior designer from a small town, carrying her baggage and insecurities like poorly packed luggage. The snorkeling itself was beautiful, clear blue water, tropical fish in impossible colors, coral formations that looked like underwater gardens. But I found it hard to concentrate on the natural beauty when my mind kept circling back to Adrian and Lena, to the easy way they moved through the water together, to her delighted laughter when he pointed out a particularly impressive fish. I stayed on the periphery of the group, telling myself I preferred to explore quietly on my own. But really, I was protecting myself from witnessing any more evidence of the connection between them. Back on the ship that afternoon, I made polite excuses about being tired from the sun and salt water. Adrian looked concerned, asking if I was feeling well, if there was anything he could do. His kindness only made me feel worse, more foolish for reading too much into his attention, more aware of how quickly I'd let myself become vulnerable. "I'm fine," I assured him. "Just need some rest. Thank you for including me today." The formality in my voice seemed to catch him off guard, but before he could respond, Lena appeared at his elbow with questions about the evening's wine bar event. I used the interruption to escape, practically fleeing to my stateroom before I could embarrass myself further. On my balcony, I sat watching the ocean and trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in my chest. Disappointment, certainly. Embarrassment at how quickly I'd let myself hope for something more. But underneath those familiar feelings was something sharper and more painful, the realization that for 3 days, I'd felt like someone worth pursuing, someone desirable and interesting. Now I felt like a middle-aged woman who'd misread the signals, who'd confused kindness with romantic interest, who'd let herself believe a fantasy. I skipped dinner that night, ordering room service instead, and eating alone on my balcony. The sunset was spectacular, streaks of orange and pink that painted the water in brilliant colors, but I could barely appreciate it. All I could think about was Adrian and Lena, probably having dinner together right now, their conversation flowing as easily as wine. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft knock at my door. My heart leapt before I could stop it, hope and dread warring in my chest. It was Adrian. He stood in the hallway looking genuinely concerned, still dressed in his clothes from the afternoon excursion but with his hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Sophia, I've been worried about you. Are you feeling all right? You seem different this afternoon." For a moment, I considered lying, making up a story about seasickness or too much sun. It would be easier than admitting the truth, that I'd let jealousy and insecurity ruin what had been a perfect day. But looking at Adrian's face, seeing the genuine care in his eyes, I found myself unable to maintain the pretense. "Can we talk?" I asked, stepping aside to let him into my stateroom. Adrian nodded, his expression growing more serious. We sat on the small couch near the balcony doors, close enough to touch but not touching, the space between us suddenly feeling charged with unspoken tension. "I saw you with Lena today," I began carefully. "You two seem close." Understanding dawned in Adrian's eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like relief. "Sophia," he said gently, "Lena is 24 years old, and engaged to a marine biologist she's been with since college. We talked about wine importing because she's thinking about opening a restaurant with her fiancé when they get married next year." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "She's engaged?" "Very happily engaged. She showed me pictures of her ring, her dress, their venue. She spent most of our conversation asking me for advice about starting a business and telling me how perfect you seem for me." I closed my eyes, mortification washing over me in waves. "Oh God, I'm an idiot." "You're not an idiot," Adrian said firmly. "You're someone who's been hurt before, who's learned to protect herself. But Sophia, look at me." I opened my eyes reluctantly, expecting to see disappointment or irritation in his face. Instead, I found warmth and understanding, and something deeper that made my breath catch. "I'm not interested in Lena," Adrian said quietly. "I'm not interested in anyone else on this ship, or anywhere else for that matter. For the past 3 days, all I've been able to think about is you. The way you laugh, the way you listen when I talk, the way you felt in my arms when I kissed you." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Really? Really?" Adrian reached for my hands, holding them gently in his. I know this is happening fast, I know we barely know each other in the conventional sense. But Sophia, what I feel for you isn't conventional. It's not safe or reasonable or easily explained. He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on the backs of my hands, his eyes never leaving mine. It's real, he said simply. What's happening between us is real. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, broke through the last of my defenses. All the fear and doubt I'd been carrying dissolved, leaving only the truth that I'd been trying so hard to protect myself from acknowledging. I was falling for him. Had already fallen, if I was being honest. Somewhere between that first dinner conversation and this moment, Adrian Clarke had become infinitely more than a cruise ship acquaintance. I'm scared, I whispered. I know. So am I. Adrian lifted one of my hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to my palm. But I'm more scared of walking away from this, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try. Something inside me shifted and settled, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was closed. All the careful barriers I'd built, all the reasonable protections I'd put in place, they seemed suddenly less important than the man sitting in front of me, offering his heart with the same quiet courage he brought to everything else. Adrian, I said softly. Yes? Instead of finishing the sentence with words, I leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all my apology and relief and growing love into the connection between us. Adrian responded immediately, his arms coming around me and pulling me closer, his kiss deep and thorough and full of promise. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and the air in the small stateroom seemed charged with electricity. Stay, I whispered against his lips, surprising myself with my boldness. Adrian pulled back just far enough to look into my eyes, his gaze searching. Are you sure? I thought about all the reasons this might be a mistake, all the ways this could complicate things, all the careful rules I'd lived by for the past 2 years. Then I thought about the way Adrian looked at me, the way he made me feel beautiful and desirable and worth pursuing. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I said. Adrian's smile was soft and wondering, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening either. He stood and gently pulled me up with him, his hands framing my face as he kissed me again, slowly and thoroughly, like we had all the time in the world. And in that moment, suspended between moonlight and possibility, we did. I woke to Adrian's gentle breathing and the unfamiliar sensation of not being alone. Morning light filtered through my balcony doors, painting everything in soft gold. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, afraid that moving might shatter this perfect bubble we created. When Adrian's eyes opened and found mine, his smile made my heart race all over again. Morning, beautiful, he murmured. Good morning, I whispered back, suddenly shy in the daylight. We dressed slowly, neither wanting to break the spell. When Adrian was ready to leave, he sat on the edge of my bed and took my hands. Last night was perfect, he said simply. You are perfect. I'm not perfect, I protested. I'm divorced and insecure, and perfect for me, Adrian interrupted, kissing me softly. But as he reached the door, reality crashed in. We hadn't exchanged phone numbers. We hadn't made plans. In the intensity of the night, the magic of the moment, we'd somehow forgotten the practical details that would let us find each other again. The realization hit us both at the same time. Adrian started. Your room, I said quickly. We stood there looking at each other across the small space, the weight of our oversight settling between us. Other passengers were already moving through the hallways outside. The ship would dock in a few hours. Time was running out. "This doesn't have to be goodbye," Adrian said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "No, of course not," I agreed, though suddenly it felt exactly like goodbye. Neither of us moved to exchange information. Something had shifted in that moment of realization, the spell breaking just enough to let doubt creep in. What if this really had been just a cruise romance? What if trying to make it real would only diminish the perfect memory? "I should let you get ready," Adrian said finally. After he left, I sat on my bed feeling hollowed out. We'd had something magical, something that had changed me in ways I was still discovering. But maybe that was enough. Maybe some things were meant to exist only in the perfect bubble where they were created. At breakfast, Adrian was already at our table when I arrived, but the easy intimacy of the past few days felt strained. We smiled and talked, but underneath the surface conversation, we were both grappling with the same question: was this an ending or a beginning? Maggie took one look at us and frowned. "What happened? You two look like someone died." "Nothing happened," I said quickly. "Everything's fine." But Maggie's knowing eyes suggested she wasn't buying it. The final day passed in a blur of packing and goodbyes. Adrian and I were polite, affectionate even, but there was a careful distance now, as if we were both protecting ourselves from the disappointment of expectations that might not be met. When the ship docked in Fort Lauderdale, we shared a taxi to the airport. At the terminal, we discovered our flights were leaving from different concourses. "This is it," Adrian said, pulling me into his arms for one last embrace. I memorized the feel of him, the scent of his cologne, the sound of his heartbeat. When we broke apart, there were tears in both our eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." "Thank you too." We kissed once more, soft and bittersweet, and then he was walking away toward his gate. I watched until he disappeared around a corner, feeling like I was losing something precious that I'd never really had. 5 months later. The cruise became a beautiful memory, something I treasured but didn't quite believe had been real. I threw myself into work, into redecorating my house, into building the life I'd always said I wanted. The master bedroom got new paint and windows that faced the garden. For the first time in 2 years, it felt like home. But on quiet evenings, I found myself thinking about Adrian. Wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about our one secret night at sea. I was packing for a business trip to Chicago when I found it. I'd pulled my cruise suitcase from the closet and was checking the pockets for anything I'd forgotten when my fingers closed around something small and smooth. A business card. Cream colored, elegant, with simple black lettering, Adrian Clarke, Clarke Wine Imports, San Francisco. I stared at it with trembling hands. He must have slipped it into my suitcase that last morning, when we'd been too emotional and too proud to ask for each other's information directly. The card felt like a message from another life, a bridge between the woman I'd been on that ship and the woman I was now. For weeks, I carried it in my purse, pulling it out at random moments, running my thumb over the raised letters. Did he even remember me? Did he wonder what had happened to the woman he'd met on the cruise? Or had I just been a pleasant interlude in his journey toward healing? 3 times I picked up the phone to call him. 3 times I lost my nerve. What if he'd moved on? What if hearing from me was an unwelcome reminder of something he'd rather forget? What if the magic had been all in my imagination? But on a gray Thursday evening, Sitting in my beautiful, empty house, I finally found the courage. My hands shook as I dialed the number. It rang once. Twice. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered. Clarke Imports, this is Adrian. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hearing his voice again after all these months made every memory come flooding back, his laugh, his touch, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious. Hello? Adrian said again, and I could hear the slight impatience of someone expecting a business call. Hi, I whispered. I am. It's Sophia. From the cruise. The silence that followed felt endless. Then Adrian's voice, soft and wondering, Sophia. My God. Sophia. I found your card, I said, the words tumbling out. In my suitcase. I didn't know if you'd remember me, if you'd want to hear from me. Remember you? Adrian's voice cracked slightly. I haven't been able to forget you. Tears sprang to my eyes. Really? I thought about you every day. Wondered where you were, how you were doing, whether you ever thought about us, I finished. Yes. We were both quiet for a moment, the weight of 5 months of wondering and hoping hanging between us. I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid it had all been just a dream. Afraid you'd forgotten me. Never, Adrian said firmly. What we had was real, Sophia. It was the most real thing I've felt in years. What happens now? I asked. Now, Adrian said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, you tell me when you can get to San Francisco. My heart soared. This weekend? I'll pick you up at the airport, Adrian said. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back had bright eyes and flushed cheeks and a smile that seemed to light her from within. She looked like someone ready for love, ready for whatever came next. Some things, I realized, were worth the wait. Worth the fear. Worth one secret night at sea and all the beautiful possibilities that followed. Now, I had a plane ticket to book.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more heartwarming stories to enjoy.